Bill C-10 is a piece of legislation that will update the Broadcasting Act for the first time since 1991. We now have companies like Netflix and YouTube. These are Canada's largest broadcasting companies, and yet the Broadcasting Act is not being applied to them. And so Bill C-10 is a long overdue update to Canada's broadcasting law to ensure that the CRTC has no choice but to include these companies equally and equitably in the Canadian content system. The CRTC since 1991 has had the power to regulate digital media. Everything from videos on your blog to YouTube and anything in between. As long as it's audio or visual that's transmitted from one source to many receivers, it's broadcasting and the CRTC can regulate it. The problem is that the CRTC has decided not to regulate any digital media at all. Not because the law says they can't, but because they passed an order preventing themselves from doing so. So this means that a rule from the 90s preventing the CRTC from forcing you or I to get a broadcasting license for putting a video like this on the internet now also applies to Netflix. And so Bill C-10 clarifies to the CRTC that this isn't okay and that they have to use their existing powers. And it also creates a bit more flexibility to make sure that the CRTC doesn't just have one tool and a one-size-fits-all for regulation, that it gives them flexibility to create different packages and combinations of regulations and contribution obligations that are appropriate for the size and shape, if you like, of all these different types of online streamers, each of which is a little bit different, and we need to make sure that we ask them to contribute in a way that's appropriate with the way they do business. There has been a lot of turmoil around a recent change to Bill C-10. There was a bit in Bill C-10 that said that any program uploaded by a user would not be regulated, and that any company whose content was just user-generated would not be regulated. And the government removed that. And all of a sudden people were saying, whoa, free speech, my social media stuff is gonna be regulated. Two things. First of all, there is another provision in the bill that very clearly says individuals using social media are not broadcasters, will not be regulated, full stop. It's in plain English. So the fear of the government coming after your social media is just false. But second, everybody assumes that regulation or the possibility of regulation means the thought police. And this is just completely made up. Bill C-10 doesn't say how these companies will be regulated, just that they can be regulated. And the most likely thing that will happen is that the CRTC will ask them to pay into a fund to support Canadian content, or maybe ask YouTube to have a little section on the front of their website giving people the option to see what's going on from new Canadian creators, for example. But the CRTC does not regulate what people say on television. They never have, and they never will. This bill was very sloppily written in many respects. For example, we're talking about regulations that apply to social media services. Social media service isn't even defined in the bill. That's, very sloppy language. Friends proposed 19 detailed amendments to this bill. So if we thought that it was great, we never would have done that. Free expression is the centerpiece. It's the founding pillar of any healthy democracy. It is a sacred right that we really can't mess with. And if there were even a modest threat to free expression, Friends would be at the front lines of the battle opposing this bill. If the average person opens up their phone or the newspaper and reads that free expression is under attack, it makes total sense for them to pay attention and be concerned. And they are trusting experts to tell them, what is going on. Unfortunately, the experts, so-called in this case, are people like Professor Michael Geist, who is the Canada Research Chair in e-commerce law. We have the Canada Research Chair in cybersecurity law, who has become a prominent commentator on this. You'll notice one word that's missing from their titles, and that is broadcasting. And so broadcasting law is very specific. Broadcasting policy is very specific. And sometimes the words in these bills, the legal definition doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not the definition that you and I will use in conversation. And so these people have other ideas about how the internet should be governed. And they are seizing on this ambiguity to create a fuss. And maybe they really think that there's a fuss. I don't know. But if you look at how the CRTC has operated historically, if you look at the protections for individuals in Bill C-10, if you look at the fact that Bill C-10 says very clearly that it must be administered in a way that respects free expression and independence of the press, if you just even think of the practical matter of how on earth would the CRTC go, and even if they wanted to, micromanage everything that you did or said, this is just not happening. It is simply not happening. And so this fear is unfortunate because we are preying upon a sensitive area that, people are right to be sensitive about any accusations that free speech is under threat. But you know what the worst thing is? You know the story of the boy who cried wolf? The wolf comes at the end. And when the wolf does come, we're not ready. And so this is really the worst part. Facebook, YouTube, these companies are already censoring your speech, but there are no rules to govern them. The CRTC could, in theory, use these powers to actually to put limits on Google and Facebook for how they limit people's speech and how they govern that speech. That is just as possible. And yet nobody entertains that idea or even that possibility. So I think it's a very regrettable discussion by militants with a very specific ideology about how the internet should look like, that it should be a First Amendment American style, anything goes kind of place. And they are, preying on little details that individual people should not, be expected to fully understand. And they are causing undue alarm. And that really is so unfortunate, because as a result of delaying this bill, companies like Netflix will no longer, be forced to contribute to Canadian content, depriving hundreds of millions of dollars every year from Canadian culture, storytelling, and from the Canadian economy. It means that we can't do anything about Facebook broadcasting the Christchurch massacre live to air, 51 people being murdered in a mosque, live streamed. If you or I did that, we'd go to jail. If a Canadian broadcaster did it, they would definitely be kicked off the air. Punishing a company like Facebook for doing things like that doesn't limit our freedom of expression. It simply ensures that our laws and values are applied to this trillion-dollar American company. And so because of all of this uproar, all of this tempest in a teapot, this faux debate about free expression, these very sensible regulations on the companies, not the users, on the companies, are being held up. And that's exactly what these, internet anarchists want. They want an internet where companies like Google and Facebook can do whatever they please in the American style. And that's something that Friends will always militate against. Well, unfortunately, there's one other thing that I need to add. The Minister of Heritage has not made matters better. He has tried to defend this bill and has failed. And so if people are looking at the critics and then watching the Minister of Heritage, flail in the wind, it makes sense for them to lose confidence and trust in this bill. He has not been able to defend it properly, which is truly, truly a shame. So where do we go from here? I think we just need to get back to common sense. We need to get back to the text of the bill. And if there are concerns about free expression, let's address them. Let's clarify them. Let's make sure that we say unequivocally that the CRTC can never regulate the individual speech of individual Canadians. In fact, we should adopt an amendment proposed by the Conservative Party, which said that these regulations will only apply to companies, not individuals, to companies with revenues in Canada of over $250 million. That was the Conservative Party's proposition. I think it is a very sensible proposition that clears the air and clears any misconceptions and makes it very clear that this would only apply to mega companies and their activities, not the actions of users. So let's get back to basics. Let's get back to the text. Let's cut the hyperbole and the hot air and the politics out of this. And I think we can start by adopting the Conservative Party's amendment to this piece of legislation. That seems like a great place to begin.